Welcome to American History Lesson 15. Industrial Age. Our lesson objectives are: identify which countries most of the immigrants came from and why immigrants flocked to the United States, identify the positive and negative impact of immigrants on the United States, identify the positive and negative traits of American politics during this time period. Immigrants and America, the melting pot begins. Between 1870 and 1920, about 20 million Europeans immigrated to the United States. Many of them came from Eastern and Southern Europe, which had not provided large numbers of immigrants before. Some, like Jews, fled religious persecution. Other immigrants came to the United States to escape economic hardship. Many left Europe full of ideas for reform and political freedom denied to them in the past. About 200,000 Chinese immigrants came from 1851 to 1883. Many thousand immigrants came from Japan as well. From 1880 to 1920, about 260,000 immigrants came from the Caribbean. Many Mexicans immigrated to the United States as well. Many Mexicans became part of the country when territory was added after the Mexican War. About 1 million immigrants came from 1910 to 1930 to escape turmoil in Mexico. Most immigrants traveled by steamship. Riding in steerage, the cargo holds below the ship's waterline. Conditions were cramped with little air or light and were unclean. Immigrants often suffered from disease. Immigrants who arrived in New York were processed at Ellis Island. The process, which took about 5 hours, determined whether they could enter the country or had to return. Asian immigrants arriving on the West Coast were processed at Ingle Island near San Francisco. Conditions were more unpleasant than at Ellis Island, and the processing was stricter. Once in the United States, immigrants felt confused and worried by the new culture. Many settled in communities with other immigrants from the same country to feel more at home. They formed organizations to help each other. While immigrants were arriving in great numbers, anti-immigration beliefs spread among some Americans. During the Depression of the 1870s, many workers feared they would lose their jobs to Chinese immigrants who accepted low wages. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, banning all but a few Chinese immigrants. The ban was not lifted until 1943. The United States and Japan reached a gentleman's agreement in 1907 and 1908, under which Japan restricted migration to the United States. The growth of America's cities. Most of the new immigrants moved to the nation's larger cities to get work in the growing industrial economy. It was cheaper and more convenient for them to live in the cities. By 1910, immigrants made up more than half of the population of 18 different cities. Many settled in neighborhoods with others from the same country. As city populations rose, overcrowding sometimes resulted. Another movement helped boost urban populations. While efficient machines increased farm production, they cost farm jobs. This caused many people to move from farms to cities to look for work. About 200,000 of these new urban dwellers were African Americans leaving the South for northern cities. The hope for many African Americans was to escape racial violence, but they found prejudice and low wages in their new homes. The growing cities had many problems. There were housing shortages, and many urban property owners converted single-family homes into multifamily apartments. This solution often placed people in crowded conditions, full of filth and disease. Growing populations created transportation problems as well. As the cities continued to grow, the transit systems could not always keep up. City officials had difficulty obtaining enough clean water. Cities began to clean and filter the water and insist on indoor plumbing, but these steps spread slowly. Removing waste and garbage was another problem that plagued the growing cities. By 1900, most cities had full-time professional fire departments, but the lack of water made fires very dangerous, and reliance on wood as a building material gave fires fuel to burn. Two major cities suffered very destructive fire: Chicago in 1871 and San Francisco in 1906. The growing crime rate was a major problem as well. Some social reformers started movements to improve life in the cities. The social gospel movement believed that Christians had a duty to try to reform conditions. Some reformers created settlement houses. These aimed at helping the poor, especially immigrants. Run mostly by women, community centers offered schooling, nursing, and other assistance. How American politics were impacted by America's growth. The large populations of cities provided an opportunity for a new political force to emerge: political machines which could be controlled by a boss. A political machine was a group that controlled a political party through voting schemes. The boss would give voters services they needed, and the machine won their votes and controlled city government. The city boss controlled the whole machine and the city government. Bosses controlled jobs in the police, fire, and sanitation departments. They controlled the city agencies that granted licenses to businesses. They controlled the money used to fund large construction projects. Many bosses came from immigrant families, and they understood immigrants' concerns. By helping to solve immigrants' problems, they won loyalty and political support of the immigrants. Political machines lead to many accomplishments in the growing cities. As they gained power, though, some bosses became corrupt. Bosses used illegal methods to win elections, such as forcing people from voting or having their supporters vote multiple times. Others abused power to become wealthy. Since the bosses controlled the police, they were seldom pursued. The Tweed Ring of New York was one of the most famous examples of corruption among city officials. Boss Tweed and many associates were finally convicted of various crimes as reform movements gained power. Corruption reached national politics. For many decades, presidents had given jobs to loyal party workers in what was called the spoils system. As a result, some workers were not qualified for the jobs they performed. Some politicians used their positions to extort money from others. Reformers wanted to end these abuses. They proposed a civil service system in which government jobs would only go to people who proved they were qualified. President Rutherford B. Hayes took some steps to reform the federal government. President Hayes aroused the anger of some members of his own party. Those angered were called stalwarts, and they opposed any changes. The next president, James Garfield, favored the reform movement, and he was assassinated by an angry stalwart. His successor, Chester Arthur, pushed through the Pendleton Act of 1883, which created the Civil Service Commission. The Civil Service Commission's role was to give government jobs based on the qualifications of the candidate, not political belief. The Pendleton Act helped reform the civil service. However, some politicians now turn to wealthy business leaders for campaign money, encouraging ongoing corruption. Fun fact: when Chester Arthur moved into the White House, he was shocked at its condition. He refused to move in until the White House was redecorated and its furniture sold off. Some of the furniture dated back to President John Adams' term and would be considered priceless today. Another issue was how high to make the tariff or tax on imported goods. Business leaders and Republicans wanted high tariffs so they could cut foreign competition. Democrats favored low tariffs to promote foreign trade. Under Republican presidents Benjamin Harrison and William McKinley, the tariff was high. Under Democrat Grover Cleveland, the tariff was lowered. What next? Take the time to go back and review the lesson on your own. After your review, complete the lesson review for the lesson and submit for grading. Remember, your submission should follow all the rules for standard written English. All submissions must be written in your own words and sources used cited at the end. How to cite sources in APA format. When you reference a source within an APA-style paper, whether it is using a direct quote, repurposing an image, or simply referring to an idea or theory, you should insert an in-text citation, the author's surname and the date of publication within parentheses, straight after a direct quote. CitationMachine.net will assist you in creating citations.